Someone shared a word with me a few weeks ago, and that word was to feed my sheep with what I'm feeding you. And so I just wanted to lay my heart down this morning that the stuff that I'm going to try and hopefully what God's going to feed you with is what I'm being fed with myself. There's nothing here that I've kind of got sorted. There's nothing that I get right. I'm on a journey and I'm walking through this as I kind of share this. God's been teaching me so much. And I also need to apologise. I was meant to be preaching a Christmas story, and I've kind of gone off on a bit of a side road, starting in the Christmas story and shooting off sideways. So you might think you're going to get a Christmas sermon. Unfortunately, I don't do what I'm told. Ask my wife. So just apologise for that one. So we're going to just watch a video, and then I'm going to come up and share a little bit more. Territory without being seen, and return to their own country. After the scholars were gone, God's angels showed up in Joseph's dream and commanded him, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. Stay until further notice. Herod is on the hunt for your child and wants to kill him." Joseph obeyed. He got up and took the child and his mother under the cover of darkness. They were well out of town by daylight. They lived in Egypt until Herod's death. An Egyptian exile fulfilled Hosea's preach, "I called my son out of Egypt." When Herod realized that the scholars had tricked him, he flew into an angry rage. He commanded the murder of every boy 2 years and under who lived in Bethlehem and its surrounding hills. That's when Jeremiah's sermon was fulfilled. A sound was heard in Ramah, a weeping and much lament. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing all solace, her children gone, dead and buried. Later, Herod died, and God's angel appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Up, take the child and his mother, return to Israel. All those who are out to murder the child are dead." And Joseph obeyed. And as I was starting to read this story and prepare for today, I was really struck by kind of the severity of this situation. And I got to thinking about what would the headline be if that was in today's news. King orders baby massacre. And you could see what it would be like. And I got to thinking about what it would have been like to be on the streets of Jerusalem at this time. I got to picturing kind of soldiers marching down streets, barging into houses, pushing past fathers trying to protect their families, and wives cowering in the corner, trying to protect their babies, screaming as their babies are kind of ripped from their arms. And for me, I was really shocked. I was really shocked as I started to hear this and read about this kind of story. And it's kind of the side of the Christmas story I'd never really thought about before. And you know, the beauty of the story, and there is beauty in kind of the madness, is that God knew. God knew that this was going to happen. You know, there were 2 prophecies that were fulfilled in this story. And that meant that, you know, God knew that this was going to happen. God knew that these kids were going to die. God knew that Jesus was going to be, his family were going to be refugees, and they were going to flee to Egypt. And there was hope in that for me. There was hope in kind of the madness. Not only did Jesus come into the chaos, Jesus came down into the chaos, and God meets us in our chaos. He meets us exactly where we are. But God also knew that this bad stuff was going to happen. And God knows that when bad stuff's going to happen in our own lives. And that gave me great hope. That gave me great hope because, you know, we all go through bad things. And why do bad things happen to good people is often a question we're asked as Christians. And I was just thinking about that. And, you know, sometimes we don't know the answer to that. Sometimes we never know the answer to why bad stuff happens. But at other times we know that we walk through seasons to grow. We walk through difficult seasons because we've got to grow in our faith, and at other times bad stuff happens because we live in a fallen world. We live in a world that has fallen to sin, and so sometimes we go through bad things, but the beauty is that God walks through all of that with us. And in and amongst this story of kind of chaos is radical obedience. And that's really what I want to speak to you about today is the obedience of the wise men and Joseph. They heard God's call on their life. The wise men, they heard the angel speak to them, and they turned around and they went home a different way. It would have been really easy, it would have been the popular thing to do, to go and speak to the king, to go and tell him exactly where Jesus was. That would have been the easy route out, and they probably put their lives at risk. You can see kind of how Herod was a nasty man. But they obeyed, even though it was probably a really difficult thing to do. And Joseph equally, he heard God's call. He heard God's call and he went. He left, and I can just imagine kind of Mary looking at him going, "You what? Just give him birth, and we're going to flee." And we don't know exactly kind of how long this is after Jesus' birth, but we know that they're fleeing war, they're refugees, and they're kind of in turmoil, and you can imagine kind of what's going through their head. But Joseph's obedience really, really struck me. And the Bible is riddled with stories of obedience and disobedience. Right from the start, right from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, we see their disobedience, right through to stories in the Old Testament of Joshua marching around the walls of Jericho and his obedience. And ultimately, obedience comes down to trust. Our obedience comes down to how much we trust God. Because if we trust God, if we knew that everything he asked us to do was because he's got a perfect plan for our life, because he's in control, because he wants to protect us, because he wants to look after us, if we knew that stuff, if we trusted that 100%, we would have no reason to disobey God. And that really struck me as I started to think about that. And it's kind of worth saying at this point that there's a difference between knowing in our head and knowing in our heart. Someone said to me at one point that the Christian journey is a simple 19-inch journey from your head to your heart. It's taking stuff that you learn, that you read about, to being in your heart. And if it's head knowledge, I can tell you something. If it's heart knowledge, you can see it in my life. And that's the difference between the two. If we know something, if we read something in the Bible, we know it in our head. But the Christian journey is taking the stuff we know in our head to being in our heart, where we're living it out day by day, when we're living it out, when we're taking those steps of obedience, when we're taking those steps in Jesus, when you can see the Bible lived out in your life. And sometimes we get caught up in kind of what obedience is going to cost us. We get focused on the cost. We get focused on, okay, God, you're calling me to this, but maybe you're forgetting about this. Maybe I know in my life I start to question God. I go, God, have you really thought this through? Have you really got this right? Because I think I see a bigger picture, and when we have a willingness to go, when we have a willingness to pursue him, that fear, that cost falls away. Because sometimes it's scary. Sometimes it's really scary, the call of obedience. And in Genesis 22, verse 17, it says, "Surely I will bless you because of your obedience." And at this moment, Abraham has just taken his son up onto a mountain to sacrifice his son. And all the parents in the room will know what must have felt like. Abraham heard God's voice and he went, and it probably made no sense at all. It was really scary. But God stepped in at the last minute and said, son, you don't need to do this, but I will bless you because of your obedience. I will bless your descendants. I will bless your children. I will bless the nation of Israel because of your obedience. And you know, I'm sure to Mary and Joseph, they were walking along the road that night thinking, how on earth have we got into this situation? I thought I was giving birth to a king, and here I am fleeing war. Often our obedience doesn't make sense. What God calls us to doesn't make sense, and it will seem scary. And I'll tell you why, because if you could do it on your own, you wouldn't need God. But God calls you to things that are bigger than what you can do in your own strength. And that's why it seems scary. And you know, sometimes when we're stepping out, we think, God, I can't do this. You know, this morning I woke up and I thought exactly the same. But you know, it's with God through us, it's with God walking with us that we have the strength to be able to step out in obedience. You know, a story that really struck me was in Mark 10, the rich young master. You know, he came to Jesus, he had everything. He had absolutely everything and he was doing good things, and he came to Jesus and he said, teacher, what do I need to do to make it into the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus said to him, he said, sell everything, give it to the poor, and follow me. And he went away sad. He went away sad because he looked at what it was going to cost him. He looked at all of his worldly possessions that he was going to lose, and he didn't see the bigger picture of what he was gaining in Jesus. He didn't see the bigger picture of what he was gaining in eternal life. And you know, our obedience will cost us far less than our disobedience. If we're obedient to God, he will give us far more than what we could ever attain in our own strength. And you know, all of us have come from different places. All of us have had different weeks. All of us have had different experiences through life. And you know, I hate speaking in definitives, but there's one thing I can definitely say about every single person in this room today, and that's that you all have a calling upon your life. You were all created for a purpose. God created each and every one of you, and he had a specific job in mind, and he calls you to that. So today, are you willing to take those steps of obedience, to take those steps to fulfill your potential? Because ultimately, our obedience leads us to freedom. When we take steps towards Jesus and we take steps towards what he calls us to, we're taking steps towards freedom. We're taking steps into the freedom that Jesus offers. And that's not necessarily freedom, in fact, that's completely different to freedom that the world offers. The world will tell you that freedom is doing what you want, when you want to do it, pursuing what you want, saying what you want. But the freedom that Jesus offers is eternal freedom. You know, I remember a few years ago as I was kind of running around trying to please everyone in my life, trying to please my friends, my family, my work. You know, I just felt exhausted and burdened. But you know, in that sweet moment, there was one moment where I just felt like I was letting everyone down. Everyone around me was disappointed in me. And I was driving, and I remember I pulled over on the side of the road and I just wept. And I cried. And God stopped me right there and he said, son, he said, if you pursue me, he said, if you're obedient to my call, he said, I will fulfill the needs of those people around you. It's only through pursuing me, it's only through the obedience to me that you can actually fulfill the needs of those people around you. Because I've got a perfect plan for your life. And in that perfect plan for your life is the perfect plan for the people around you. And you know, there's a real peace that comes with that freedom. There was a real peace, there was a burden that was lifted off my shoulders in that moment. And I just remember as a little boy when, you know, I was I know it's hard to believe, but I was a bit mischievous. And if you told me not to do something, I was that kid that just went and did it straight away. If my parents said, "Ben, don't touch this," what did I do? Touch it. And I was always getting myself into trouble. And there was that moment where my heart was beating. What's Mum going to say? What's Dad going to say when he gets home? There was that moment where my heart was racing. And I compare that to those moments where I was where I should have been, doing what I'd been asked to do, and the peace that came with that. There's a peace that comes when we are where we're supposed to be, just as Mark was sharing. There's a peace that when we're stood and we're walking with Jesus, when we're doing what we're called to do, the madness of life just seems to kind of fade away because we are exactly where we're supposed to be. We're in the eye of the storm, but God's with us, and there's a peace that comes with that. Ultimately, through our obedience, God will protect us. You see, in this story, we see the obedience of Joseph and we see the obedience of the wise men. And through that, Jesus is kept safe. God used them. God used their obedience, and he used them to protect his own son. And that's just absolutely amazing. As I started to think about that, and I started to think about what obedience that he would use people of the world to protect his own son. And there's stories in the Bible where we kind of see this time and time again. We see Jonah. And Jonah's disobedient. And he's running from God, and he's on a ship, and God sends a storm. And sometimes there's storms that go on in our lives. Sometimes there's storms and God stops us in our tracks. Sometimes we'll even trip over. 1 Peter 2 verse 7 and 8 says, "To you who trust him, he's a stone to be proud of. But to you who refuse to trust him, the stone the workmen threw out is now the chief foundation stone. For the untrusting, it's a stone to trip over, a boulder blocking the way. They trip and they fall because they refuse to obey, just as predicted." Jonah is stopped in his tracks. He's stopped right where he is, and he's turned around. But the beauty of the story of Jonah is that he's massively used for his kingdom, for God's kingdom. He sees a whole city saved. And so a whole city is saved by one person's obedience. Church, I really want to challenge you. What would this church look like in 12 months' time if we're all obedient to God's call in the next 12 months? What will this town look like next year if we're obedient to his call? If one person's obedience changed a whole city, look around you. How many people are in this room? The impact that we could have as a church, the impact that we could have as a community on this town will be absolutely massive. That just really struck me as I was starting to prepare this. What would this church, what would this town look like? As we walk round, we see the hopelessness. But through one obedient man, a whole city was changed. If there's 30, 40, 50 people in this room, what impact could we have on this town? And what impact could they have then on this nation? I really want to inspire you this morning to be obedient to God's call. But how do we become more obedient? How do we become obedient to God's call on our life? Well, here's just 3 really practical ways that we could step out in obedience. Firstly, through a relationship. If you're to obey God, firstly you've got to hear his voice. And every single person in this room, no matter whether you're a Christian or not, no matter whether you've been walking with Jesus for 5 days or 50 years, every single person in this room can hear the voice of God. Every single person in here was created to have a relationship with the Father. The Bible says that you are my sheep, and that my sheep will know my voice. We are all sheep. We are all God's children. And so through a relationship with him, through time spent with God, we will hear his voice. You know, the husbands and the wives, the parents in here will always know the voice of their loved ones. If there's a crowded room and as a mother or a father, you hear someone crying, you know that that's your child. And the beauty of that is that that's because you've spent time with them. You've spent time getting to know their voice, getting to know their sound. You know, you can even hear when someone walks into a room because you know how they walk. And it's through that time spent with God, it's through that time spent in prayer, talking to God, but also in the silence, letting God speak to you. Often we just get that so wrong. We spend so much time speaking to God and not enough time just sat in his presence, letting him speak to us. But it's through time with him that we will be able to hear his voice. You know, and another way that we will learn to be obedient to his call is through the Bible. The Bible is the only book in history that's completely timeless. It's as relevant to the people that it was given to as it is to us today. And I guarantee you that the stories in the Bible will speak directly into your circumstances, exactly as those letters of Paul spoke to the Corinthians. They'll speak to you as much today as they did back then, because the stories are timeless, the word is alive. And so as you open the word, as you start to spend time with him, reading his word, as you drip feed your soul with words of truth, I guarantee you your faith will start to rise. As you look at the stories of radical transformation in the Bible, your faith will start to bubble up. But you know it can't stop there. You know, the devil doesn't care if you can recite every single word of the New Testament, but do nothing about it. You know, the devil doesn't care if you know the book of Isaiah back to front, upside down, inside out, but it doesn't impact your life. You know, you've got to take steps of faith. You've got to step out to be able to know the goodness of God. You've got to hear his call and you've got to go. And you know, sometimes, church, that means we're going to get it wrong. That means we're going to step out, and it means we're going to fall flat on our face. But can I encourage you this morning that if you fall flat on your face, God's opinion of you doesn't change. If you fall flat on your face tomorrow morning, God's opinion of you doesn't change. You're still his son, you're still loved, you're still cherished, you're still created for a purpose. You know, there is grace enough for the journey. There's grace enough that you can step out and fall and God will pick you up. But you know, if we don't step out, if we never step out for God, then how are we ever going to be obedient to his call? You know, by getting it wrong, we'll know that, okay, that wasn't God. But by getting it right, we'll know that that is. And comparing the two, you'll be able to know the two voices in your head. You'll be able to discern between what was God and what wasn't. You know, if God says, if you hear a voice in your head, why don't you go and pray for that person? It's probably not the devil. You know, if you hear something in your heart that says, why don't you reach out and see if this person's okay? It's probably not the devil. The devil will come as a sweet voice afterwards that said, did God really say that? Did God really ask you to do this? So just really encourage you, church. Maybe this morning you need some courage. Maybe you need some courage to be obedient. Maybe right now you're running from God. Maybe you're Jonah and there's a storm and you're running from God. Or maybe today you didn't know that you could hear God's voice, or that God had a plan for your life. Or maybe right now life just sucks. You're hurt, lonely, angry, or you're in need of protection. As a church family, we believe that this isn't just a fun story of God born 2,000 years ago. We believe that God's alive today, that he's here with us. So church, why don't we get messy? Tim's and the band are just going to come back up and play a final song, but as this song's playing, why don't we step out? Why don't we start praying for each other in our rows, whether you want to come down the front? Why don't we respond this morning to the calling of God? Because church, what is this town going to look like in 12 months' time if we're obedient to his call?